Good evening, everyone, and welcome to week 4 of Great Decisions at Manitowoc Public Library. Except, as you can see tonight, we're not at Manitowoc Public Library. We are in our separate homes. I'm home because we had a lot of wonderful weather in Manitowoc, which led to some really amazing leaks coming through the roof of the library today. So we shut down at 2. And Professor Farrell, we talked to him earlier, and it just wasn't the safest day to make your way to Manitowoc on the road. So since we have this technology in place, we figured we might as well use it. So before I turn things over to Professor Farrell for the evening, I just wanted to make a couple announcements, as I am sure you're used to me doing at this point. The first thing is, if you have any questions or comments, even though you're watching this remotely, just enter them into the comment section on either Facebook or YouTube. Enter them, they'll get through to me, and we will get to them at the end of the lecture, as many of them as we can. Secondly, I would definitely be remiss if I didn't thank our sponsors for the Great Decisions lecture series, because without them, we wouldn't be able to bring you the complete lecture series for this, our 16th year. So I just wanted to go ahead and thank the League of Women Voters of Manitowoc County, the Manitowoc Public Library Foundation, Manitowoc Public Library, the Lakeshore Unitarian Universalist Fellowship, and Lakeshore Pax Christi. So give them a big round of applause at home, because without them, we wouldn't be able to bring you this wonderful series. Also, I wanted to bring up a couple other programs that we have coming up at the library next week, and then we'll dive into Professor Farrell's lecture this evening. The first one is, and Professor Farrell, my apologies, I need to take you out of the picture while I bring these other slides up. Thank you for your understanding. That's a lot of Tim. I'm going to take myself out in order to show you this first slide, which is a program we have coming up next Thursday, which is March 9th at 6 p.m. It's called The War on Condiments with Chef Andrew Dunbar. Andrew is a local chef in Manitowoc, and he is declaring war on store-bought condiments, which, for example, ketchup is so full of high fructose corn syrup, and there's so much plastic waste involved with condiments. He's going to show you how to make homemade ketchup, homemade mustard, homemade mayo, probably some homemade tartar sauce as well, and just how you can make your own condiments that are just more than maskers of flavor of the food you want to put them in. Registration is required. Head to the Manitowoc Public Library website to register. There's a banner you could click on. It's www.manitowoclibrary.org, and that's coming up next Thursday, March 9th. And then I wanted to bring up a program that was coming up on that Saturday. It's the 3rd annual Lakeshore Area Seed Swap, which is going to be Saturday, March 11th from 9 a.m. until noon in the Balkanski Community Room. We're doing this in partnership with the Lakeshore Seed Collective. And essentially, if you're not familiar with a seed swap is essentially like a potluck, except with seeds for gardening. So you can get an early start on what you want to put in your garden indoors, as obviously it's not time to put them outdoors yet. But and even if you don't have seeds to bring with you, feel free to show up and take some seeds with you to plant. So let me now go back to our regular scheduled program with all the announcements out of the way. There is Professor Farrell. I'm going to bring myself back in briefly. But Professor Farrell, the one thing I forgot when I ran out of the office today was your bio. So if you wouldn't mind telling everyone who's following along a little bit about yourself, and then we'll dive right into the heart of your lecture.
All right. Thank you very much, Tim. I think this is roughly possibly as many as 15 years that I have spoken at the Great Decisions series there in Manitowoc. So I consider those folks there, those fine folks in Manitowoc, my friends and colleagues in all these talks and discussions that we've had going back quite a few years now. But I, of course, taught at Ripon College for 40 years, even went back last year for a semester. They needed a little help in the department. I taught Latin American politics, not the only specialty, but that was a course that I taught for the entirety of my tenure there. Also, I recently retired from the Fond du Lac County Board of Supervisors, where I was a supervisor, excuse me, representing the Ripon area for 28 years and chair of the board for 16 years. So I have some practical experience as well. I also would mention that the Latin America topic is very pertinent this year because I just spent the month of December mainly in South America, along with a week in Antarctica. So I recently have had that opportunity to spend time in Argentina and Chile. And so I will add a few of my observations from that visit as well.
All right, fantastic. And you did mention that you had been at the lectures 15 years. Actually, it's 16 years. And I wanted to make the announcement that Professor Farrell is the only speaker that has given a lecture all 16 years of the Great Decisions lecture series at Manitowoc. So that's a great achievement. And thank you for coming back again on this amazingly bad weather day from the comfort of your home. So I'll stop talking now. I'll take myself out of the picture and let's get to your lecture.
Very good. All right. Thank you very much, Tim. And again, I want to thank the sponsors for Great Decisions. And frankly, I am thrilled to learn that I have been invited there for the entirety of the entire series. And hopefully, if you'll have me back, I'll be willing and able to continue on. Hopefully, I won't be a disqualifying presentation tonight. So our topic,
I highly doubt it.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Riding the waves in Latin American politics, pink, blue, or green. And again, this is more or less the topic signed by the Foreign Policy Association. Had an excellent article in their booklet by Jorge Castaneda, who's a well-known scholar on Latin America. And if you had a chance to read that, some of my comments will kind of bounce off some of the things that he had to say, but I'm going to be adding quite a few other things as well. If we could go to the first slide. I thought tonight, again, not to spend too much time on background, but I do believe a certain amount of background would be important here. So one thing we need to realize is that the Western Hemisphere is actually one of the more recently populated areas of the world. So if we look down the lower left-hand portion of the slide there, you'll see that, well, actually, the upper one, the out of Africa migration dates back to about 50 to 60,000 years ago. And you can see the arrows going to Europe, to Oceania, even to Australia as long ago as 40,000 years ago, also into East Asia. But then you see crossing over during the Ice Age, that Bering Sea area of today was actually exposed land, and they're calling that Beringia. And if now we look at part B of that slide, we see peoples coming from northeastern Asia, Siberia, into that Beringia area. And if we look at number C, letter C there, we see that they actually, people stayed there for as long as 15 to 30,000 years. They were kind of trapped there by the ice on the right, on the America's side and by the inhospitable tundra on the Asian side, but they did live and flourish there. And finally, as the ice began to retreat, they did migrate down either the coast on the Pacific Ocean there, or the coast of the Americas, or as the glaciers parted, they actually also came by an inland route. If we could go to the next slide, we see that they began to move out around 17,000 years ago and found themselves, as they progressed down what we now call the Americas, a veritable Garden of Eden for them, because no human beings had been there before. There was abundant flora and fauna for them to hunt and gather. The animals, many of them megafauna as they're called, excuse me, had never seen humans, had no fear of them. They were easily hunted. So the population increased as much as 60-fold in the next 3,000 years. We do know there are about 3 branches. They moved very quickly down the hemisphere, and we have the Monteverde settlement in Chile that is over 14,000 years old. So they were able to progress relatively quickly down the Western Hemisphere. This is a fascinating topic. A lot of this information is new, and it's becoming discoverable through the human genome and DNA analysis, along with archaeology, of course, and actually language analysis, because these things are all related. If you're interested, Jennifer Raff is an author who is writing very prolifically on this right now. But we're, of course, more concerned with more contemporary events. So let's move to the next slide. But we should recognize that the Native Americans did build numerous great civilizations. The Maya and the Inca are the best known, but there are numerous others as well. Machu Picchu is the picture in the center bottom there. Diego Rivera, the Mexican artist, painted a picture of what he thought the ancient Aztec capital may have looked like. And so there were a great deal of achievements. If we could move to the next slide, we see we're not sure, of course, about how many Native Americans there were at the time of the Colombian encounter and the subsequent conquest by Spaniards and Portuguese. May have ranged between 60 and 100 million. However, that population was decimated over the next century, primarily due to disease, but exacerbated by war, massacres, enslavement, overwork, deportation, the loss of will to live or reproduce, malnutrition and starvation from the breakdown of trade networks, and the loss of their subsistence food production due to their lands being taken over by the conquistadores. So Mexico on the right-hand side is an example from the population around 1520, smallpox, then some other epidemics. You can see just the incredible decimation of the populations. If we move to the next slide, again, of course, over the last few centuries, we have seen obviously Native American populations have rebounded, but if you look carefully at the map on the left-hand side, the darker areas, and these are provinces or states within Latin American countries, we see that the area of Bolivia and Peru in South America, also parts of Colombia, are the darkest indicators on the map. That shows that they have the highest concentrations. Given the fact that a majority of the population of Bolivia do have indigenous roots, it's striking that not until 2006 was an indigenous person elected president of Bolivia, but that was Evo Morales, who did serve there from 2006 to 2019. Also, Central America and Southern Mexico have relatively high proportions of indigenous peoples, and a few in Chile and Argentina as well. If we could move to the next one, let's look at a few other just generalizations about Latin America. These are relatively big countries, and just from glancing at a map, you might not realize it, but for example, on the left, South America is about 3 times the size of Europe. If you look carefully there, you can see there's 3 Europes kind of fit into South America. Population-wise, Europe does have more, but still, if you look and see, Venezuela alone has as much as all the Nordic countries, plus Estonia and Latvia, Lithuania. Brazil is as big as Italy, Germany, Poland, several other countries put together. Mexico is as big population-wise as the Iberian Peninsula and France, Belgium. Chile is as big as Greece and several Balkan countries, etc. Argentina, roughly the same as Turkey. So you can see, Ukraine. That is Ukraine. That is not Turkey. But still, Argentina with a substantial population as well as area. Having just been down there, I can tell you it's a big country and there's a lot of wide open spaces, especially in the south. So we have an idea that these are, big countries, and certainly by comparison with other world areas. Let's move to the next. Here we have kind of a schematic history that I'm going to go over pretty rapidly. I'm not going to hit every single item. Number 1, we've covered peopling of the Americas, development of their civilizations. Number 2, conquest and the colonial regime, 1492, the Colombian encounter through about 1811. This is the first contact other than the Viking colonization of what is today Eastern Canada. We do know that around the year 1000 and for about 50 years, the Scandinavian origin Vikings did at Landstemedo and a few other places have colonies. Again, they did not last. We have absolutely no evidence of any intermarriage or any intermingling of that sort between Native Americans and the Norse people. This is what the geneticists have told us from their extensive studies that can now be very precise, as I mentioned earlier. So the Native American people had no interaction with peoples other than themselves until the arrival of the Spanish and the Portuguese following 1492. We do see the decimation of the native populations, but also the establishment of the cultural and economic systems of Spain and Portugal, which are very oligarchic. And so this is a term that's used often with Latin America. And I saw evidence of this, even till today. In Patagonia, as well as the Pampas in Argentina, huge cattle ranches of over 50,000 hectares, which in our terms, acres, that's over 150,000 acres. I don't think there's any ranches in the United States or Canada anywhere near that size. But they still exist to this day, and that was the backbone of the economy for many of these countries, especially in the temperate zones, for several centuries. We go to 1811, we see that Spain and Portugal are distracted by and weakened by Napoleonic wars. And we see then the wars of independence as many of the Latin American countries gain their independence from Spain. Brazil was the major country that was colonized by Portugal. Their route to independence was a little bit more complex, as they actually housed the Portuguese emperor for a while, and then named their own emperor, his son, before they became a republic much later in the 19th century. If we could move to the next. There's a lot of turmoil, though, following independence in most of these countries. So you had regional strongmen or caudillos attempting to establish rule, fighting each other. This was a very turbulent and time, one that we, of course, had our own civil war shortly after this period. But other than that, we did not have the turmoil and the rampaging throughout the territory that most of these Latin American countries did have to survive. By 1850, though, individual strongmen began to emerge and exercise national control, unifying dictatorships. The archetype here would be Porfirio Diaz in Mexico. By 1890, though, that began to give way to what we call oligarchic democracy. So legislatures were given more power, more rule of law, less strongman rule. But again, the caudillo tradition does remain, at least sometimes under the surface, sometimes more prominently in Latin American politics, even up to the present day. If we could move to the next. After the Depression hit, that brought down many of the oligarchic democracies. This is when we begin to see populist leaders emerge, such as Getulio Vargas in Brazil, and above all, Juan Perón in Argentina. And these are people who tried to bring the lower classes more into the political systems and to gain more economic benefits. And they did this, but sometimes at the expense of democratic norms, as they became more and more dictatorial, with Perón being ousted in 1955, going into exile, but returning to the Argentina in the 1970s. But by the 1950s and 60s, the revolution of rising expectations, the Alliance for Progress, tried to support economic development. We did see some revolutions then in Bolivia and, of course, Cuba, led by Fidel Raul Castro, Che Guevara. That regime still in power in Cuba, of course. But that was then followed by a period of what we call bureaucratic authoritarianism, or actually military dictatorship in many cases, most markedly in Brazil and Argentina during this time. But those are finally ended. Then we get to the more present period of more democracy, much less military intervention. It's not totally absent, but as we'll see, but it's much reduced. We see liberalization of the economies, more free trade, and a lot of success, at least during certain periods. However, the global financial meltdown of 2009 fueled the blue wave in the 2010s. So that brings us up to the current time to really begin our analysis here. So we can move to the next one, though still a little bit more background. I'm not going to spend a great deal of time on this because we just, but it's something that is of interest if you would like to look into it. This is a world cultural map, based on public opinion surveys. And basically they evaluate the responses on two axes. One is traditional versus secular values, the other on the horizontal axis, survival versus self-expression. And you can see how the different world areas kind of group themselves, not super tightly, but yet somewhat coherently. And so in this analysis, we see that the Latin American countries there's considerable variation within, as there is with all of the world areas. But so, for example, Uruguay would be the most self-expressive in terms of values. And while Argentina and Brazil are secular at the same level as Uruguay, they're still more survival oriented, probably indicating that their economies are not quite as good. Okay, well, that again, if we look down at the lower left-hand corner of Latin America, we see that Nicaragua would be the least secular, as well as the least, or one of the least self-expressive within. Perhaps that gives us a hint as to why they have embraced the Sandinista regime out of economic insecurity. But this is just a starting point for getting a feel for the political cultures of these countries and how they compare to other world areas. So we move to the next. Just basic economic analysis, GDP per capita, very imperfect measure, but again, just as an indication, it's an average. Take GDP, divide by population. Here, the dark blue colors are the highest, over 60,000. We don't have any Latin American countries in that level. We have to go down to the yellow color, 10,000 to 20,000. And here we see that the southern cone of Argentina, Chile, and Uruguay, along with Mexico and Panama and Costa Rica, these are the most prosperous, at least in those terms, of the Latin American countries. The red is the lowest. There we see Venezuela, which of course has had an economic collapse since the establishment of the authoritarian regime there, unfortunately. The same holds true for Nicaragua. So the economic indicators are not good for that variety of leftist regime. And the same is for Cuba. And having been in Cuba myself, I know that it is struggling very, very mightily economically. And Cuba in particular was relying extremely heavily on tourism after the collapse of the Soviet Union, which had given them a lot of aid in the past. That ended, of course, in 1990, but then relying on tourism in Cuba, what happened with the COVID pandemic, we know is disastrous for tourism. So Cuba, even though it isn't colored dark red here, it should be, because they are struggling very mightily. But the other Latin American nations, for the most part, are, again, not among the poorest of nations. We see that more in Africa and parts of Asia, but they're also not among the most well-off economically, but sort of in the middle there. Moving to the next, income inequality. This is a big issue in Latin America. So again, not the most unequal, which would be the very darkest coloration of the country, but on the other hand, Brazil is only one category up with a Gini index between 45 and 50. Colombia being really the worst, most unequal distribution. This is an issue that fuels the leftist populist leaders that we are seeing in the pink wave, that we most definitely have seen 2 times already in the 21st century. So we saw it in the first decade, and then we saw a blue wave kind of reaction during the 2010 to 2017 or 18 era. But now we see another red or pink wave, and this income inequality is a big reason for that. The populist leaders are able to mobilize a lot of the working class, the poor peasantry in the countryside, get them to the ballot box and get elected based on promises to redress the economic imbalance between rich and poor. Okay, if we could move to the next. Right now, again, this is not unique to Latin America, but there are some, high inflation figures. You see most of the countries, Brazil, Mexico, Colombia, Peru, Chile, all around 10%, which is a bit more than even we had in the last 2 years. But Argentina is off the charts. Now, again, most of the Latin American countries have seen hyperinflation. They've seen inflation in the hundreds of percents or even thousands in the past. So this isn't by far the worst that they have seen, but it's still a real challenge, and probably the reason that Argentina's left of center government will be voted out of office next year. That seems almost a certainty. The next chart on the right, though, does indicate that the inflation is projected to become at least a little bit more reasonable in the years going forward, but for the moment, it is a definite concern. Excuse me. Again, having been in Argentina, I can tell you that when people do not even want their own money, that is probably a sign that things are not going well. And that was definitely the case there. So if you are, any of you listening or watching or planning to go to Argentina, I would say take plenty of US currency and nothing illegal, of course, but if you are going to tip someone in the restaurant or for other services that they provide for you, if you can give them a little of good old American greenbacks, they would appreciate that much more than their own currency, which has devalued tremendously under the current Peronist administration there. And that is the number one reason they are probably going to be voted out next year, but we'll come back to that in a moment. All right, let's move to the next then. This is Human Development Index. This is a more, not so much just income, but education levels, health levels, infant mortality rates, things of this nature. And we see that Latin America is above the world average and, not as high as among the wealthiest nations in the OECD, but still above average on world standards. But again, a lot of variation within the Latin American countries themselves. So the Human Development Index is very high, again, in the southern cone of Chile, Argentina, Uruguay, also Costa Rica and Panama, but lower in countries like Venezuela and Bolivia. So again, some of these patterns are pretty persistent. Move to the next. Corruption. Again, this is an endemic problem in Latin America. Many of the current leaders gained office, such as AMLO in Mexico, pledging to fight corruption, have zero tolerance. None of them have been entirely successful. Again, there are some world areas that are even more corrupt, as indicated, but a lot of room for improvement here among the Latin American nations, as it shows. Moving to the next, violence. And here we see a map that on the left that attempts to combine poverty rates. So the darker the color, the higher the poverty rate, and the larger the representation of the country, the more homicides per 100,000 people. So we see here that northern tier of Central America, excuse me, Guatemala, Belize, El Salvador, and Honduras as the most violent of the countries. And it's no coincidence that this is where a large number of refugees and asylum seekers are approaching the southern border of the United States and go through Mexico or find other ways to get there. And this is one of the major reasons. They're fleeing not only poverty, but also violence and a very, very difficult life. Especially those countries are very, very disproportionately represented both on the poverty scale and the violence scale. If we move to the next, here, now we're getting more into the politics and the type of regime, democratization. And so again, full democracies in Latin America, only a few are recognized as full democracies: Uruguay, Chile, Costa Rica. Although notice that the United States is not considered a full democracy at this particular time, but rather a flawed democracy, but then so are several of the Western European countries, with the Scandinavian or Nordic countries, more properly, along with New Zealand, being considered the most fully and firmly established democracies in the world today. But on the right-hand side, there's also been some decrease in the democracy index in Latin America over the last 14 years, as you can see. In fact, more backsliding because of more attempts to interfere with things like free press, free speech, issues of that nature. That has accounted for some of the democratic backsliding, which it is disturbing to see that Latin America leads all world regions. Now, they have not turned into dictatorships for the most part, again, other than Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. The military has largely stayed out, and that is certainly an advance over the 70s and 80s. But still, it is important to note and try to make sure that it doesn't go further in terms of the backsliding on democratic norms and institutions that we have seen. Moving to the next, again, just some rankings. Again, we see on the left-hand side, Uruguay, Chile, Costa Rica, Trinidad, Tobago, and Jamaica as consolidated democracies. A number of what are termed defective democracies. Mexico termed a highly defective democracy, moderate autocracies, and then Haiti, Nicaragua, Cuba, and Venezuela as hardline autocracies. On the right-hand side, Freedom House, a little bit more liberal, so it considers as free all of those countries in green. Then the yellow ones, partly free, and again, only 4 that Freedom House considers not free. Haiti, which I think at this time is pretty much a failed state. And then again, the 3 Marxist dictatorships of Nicaragua, Venezuela, and Cuba. Okay, move to the next. Now we get into the real heart of at least the article's emphasis from the Great Decisions booklet. I'm not going to, just follow that. You can read that for yourself, but this is a diagram taken from a related source. So again, on the left-hand side, you see the governments in 2011. That's on your far left. The governments in that year that were members of the Sao Paulo Forum. And the Sao Paulo Forum is an organization formed all the way back in the 1990s of various shades of left of center governments. Now, some are very moderately left of center, others, like Cuba, are more hard left of center. But the Sao Paulo Forum, again, if you look at 2011 on the left-hand side, obviously very significant representation. So that was what we would term that first pink wave of the first decade of the 21st century. Then if we look at the middle map, though, there we see that was reduced. The red coloration is reduced by very significant. So that's the blue wave that we saw in the 2010s or teens that I also mentioned, with just relatively few exceptions at that time. But now we go to the right-hand side, 2023, we see again even more perhaps, about the same as in 2011, except this time there are some countries that never really had leftist leaders before. So, for example, Mexico. They did not have a real leftist president in Mexico before Andre Manuel Lopez Obrador, or AMLO as his nickname has it. Mexico did not have a left-wing president since Lázaro Cárdenas of 1934. So that is a long time ago. That is over, roughly 90 years ago. But Mexico joins the pink tide, as well as other countries. Honduras, that's a first for them as well. Panama, considered the Torrijos party back in power. But then we look at South America and we see Uruguay has left after a long run of left of center broad front governments in Uruguay, they did elect a conservative the most recent time. But many of the other countries, as you can see, including Colombia, also for the very first time, a left-leaning president. That is a first there again for a long time. So at the present time, then, we not only have a large number of left of center governments in Latin America, but in fact, it now encompasses the 7 largest countries in terms of population and 80% of the entire population of South America. So that is definitely a pink wave, and we're going to take a look at some of the specific examples here in for a few minutes. So let's move to the next. Again, this is from the article by Castaneda, which again, he makes a further distinction among 3 kinds of pink or leftist regimes: the dictatorships, Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela; social democracies, Bolivia, Brazil, Chile, and Colombia; and what he calls more left of center populist countries, Argentina. There he's referring to the Peronists in the Fernandez administration, Mexico, as we said, under AMLO, and Peru. Now, Peru has, of course, recently undergone some tremendous turmoil. But here, these are all members of the Sao Paulo Forum, which again, as the text indicates, covers a broad range of left of center all the way to hard left parties and positions. All right, let's move to the next. We'll look at some elections here. Just to give you an example, in Mexico, this was their presidential election of 2012, won by Enrique Peña Nieto of the PRI party, which had been a ruling party in Mexico for many decades before the year 2000. But in the case of Mexico here, we see that they don't require majority vote. So Nieto was elected just with a plurality of only 39% of the vote. At that time, AMLO received 32%, and Vasquez 26%. That is kind of a dangerous arrangement, but they are not changing it. It's going to be the same, but most of the Latin American countries do elect their presidents by direct popular vote, but most of them have a runoff provision, as we'll see. But if we move to the next slide, we'll see that in 2018, AMLO won not just a plurality, which is what he would have required, but an actual out and out majority, 53%, without a runoff. And what has he actually done? He has campaigned against neoliberalism or an excessive deregulation of the economy. He's tried to bring back some governmental controls. He's wanted to help the working class, at least from his viewpoint, raising a minimum wage, especially try to help agriculture, which Mexican agriculture, I think, undeniably was hurt by NAFTA. Again, there's a lot of debate over the merits of NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement. But one thing is clear, that American U.S. agriculture was so much more efficient that Mexican agriculture of staple crops definitely could not compete. On the other hand, they set up manufacturing plants with lower wage labor that benefited, their economy. AMLO was not a fan of NAFTA, but as president, he signed the newly renegotiated NAFTA with President Trump and with Canada, which frankly was not that different from the original NAFTA. So he has joined on to at least the revised version. But he did accomplish a minimum wage increase of 20%. As far as corruption and the drug cartels, he promised to fight them with education and jobs rather than bullets. Not clear how well that has worked. He recently has tried to make some reforms in the National Electoral Institute up to the presidential elections coming up next year, 2024, which he cannot run for because after a 6-year term, you cannot succeed yourself in Mexico. And that is unpopular with quite a few people trying to fiddle with the Electoral Commission, which most people feel has given Mexico fair elections since the year 2000. But nevertheless, overall, AMLO has been consistently quite popular. So his left of center populism and rhetoric, railing against bureaucrats and plutocrats and oligarchs, things of that nature, actually has stood him in very good stead. He has consistently had 60% or better approval ratings from the from the Mexican public opinion. When people are asked how would they characterize his administration, the most popular words are, it's been transformational, it's been a success, and it's provided us with hope. And those are 3 very positive things that are going to be kind of difficult for their opponents to overcome. Right now, his party, the Morena Party, holds a huge lead in public opinion preferences looking ahead to that presidential election in 2024. And the leading candidate, this has not been decided yet that it will be their candidate, is the woman who is mayor of Mexico City at the present time, Claudia Sheinbaum. And if she holds up her lead in the Morena polling for presidential candidate and goes on to win, she would be the first woman president of Mexico, and also the first Jewish president of Mexico. So she could be a transformational figure in her own right. But the pink tide in Mexico has been pretty successful, and that's a country where it has some staying power. At least it looks like at this present time. If we could move on. Next slide. Chile. This was quite a surprise, but again, Chile, since the Pinochet dictatorship was ended in 1989, Chile has had a series of centrist or center-left presidents. Michelle Bachelet, you may know, a very famous first woman president of Chile. Then she was elected 2006. 2010, a conservative, Sebastian Pinera. They cannot succeed themselves immediately, but they can in Chile have 2 terms if they sit out for at least a term. So in 2014, Bachelet was elected president once again, served 4 years. Then Pinera was elected again. So they alternated for 16 years, center left and center right. But the year after Pinera was reelected, the following year, 2019, violent protests erupted all over Chile and were very, very significant, brought the country to a standstill, protesting high cost of living, the way inequality was getting worse under Pinera's conservative principles. One of the most prominent leaders of those protests was a young former law student named Gabriel Boric. And as we can see here, in 2021, he was elected president of Chile. So if you want to take a quick look at here, they do require a runoff, which most political scientists, including myself, would tell you is a better way to do it. So in the first round on the left-hand column, you can see that Boric got only about 26% of the vote, with the rest of the vote. Actually, more votes were obtained by Jose Antonio Cast of the Christian Social Front, and he is considered a pretty far-right potential leader, and he actually got more votes in the first round. But because if that had taken place in Mexico, Cast would have been president. But in Chile, requiring the runoff, then many of the voters for those other candidates rallied behind Gabriel Boric, so he was able to win rather handily in the second round. I will mention with regard to Chile, one of the first things that was done, and let's go to the next slide for that, was to propose a new constitution, because the 1980 constitution had been promulgated under the military dictator Augusto Pinochet, and many people, in fact, a clear majority, felt it was time for a change. So I don't know if you can read on the lower right-hand side, but that's the timeline that they agreed in October of 20. Thank you, Tim. In October 2020, they voted to write a new constitution. Then in May of the next year, they elected members of the convention, and then they had the convention convened. They met for 12 months. Then they submitted a draft, and then there's a ratification referendum. And up above that, you just see the political coloration of the various members of the Constitutional Convention. However, when it was actually brought to a vote, the new constitution, what they came up with would have been one of the most progressive documents ever seen in a democratic society. And it was a bit too much in a number of areas for the majority of the Chilean population. So they voted no, just as they had voted no in the plebiscite way back in 1988 to get rid of Pinochet, to not approve his continued rule. Here in 2022, just this past September, they voted almost 62% to 38% to reject that proposed constitution. Again, it was a very ambitious document. I can see that it was a bit much to swallow, even for people, a majority of whom wanted a new constitution. This one had 388 articles. The US Constitution has 7, not that we do everything right, but 388 articles. Over 110 individual rights were guaranteed. Nature was given rights, animals were given rights. Possibly the biggest, cradle to grave network and social insurance policies were to be seen as a right for all citizens, but possibly the biggest barrier to approval in Chile was the declaration that Chile would be considered a plurinational country, that is, with more than one nation within alluding to the indigenous populations, which are not that large in Chile, but they do exist. And again, this is, even though Ecuador and Bolivia are both officially plurinational by their own, declarations, this seemed to be one of the sticking points against the new constitution. But they are going to go back to work. They will convene a new constitutional convention and try to come up with something that is more moderate and less breathtaking in its scope to still replace that Pinochet constitution. If we can move to the next, talk about Brazil a bit. Here too, we looking here at the 22 election, just last fall. But again, just in terms of context, Brazil was under military dictatorship from 1964 to 1985. First, several presidents did pursue neoliberal policies. Fernando Henrique Cardoso from 94 to 2002 was probably the most successful of those. But following him in 2002, on his third try, Fernando Luis da Silva, or Lula da Silva, was elected and the first leftist to lead Brazil since Getúlio Vargas back in the 1950s. And Lula da Silva was very successful his 2 terms as president from 2002 through 2010. Now that coincided with a tremendous boom in commodity prices, which Brazil is a major exporter of. They got a lot of money and funds from that, but he did make sure, Lula da Silva, that it was distributed to the poor. He had a program called Bolsa Familia, which is family purse. He also invested heavily in education, healthcare, and actually reduced the inequalities of income and wealth significantly during his 8 years in office. So he left very popular. His successor in his same party, Dilma Rousseff, was also elected to 2 consecutive terms, but the economy had turned a bit sour by then, and she was not as adept or popular as he was. She was impeached in 2016, removed from office. Meanwhile, Lula da Silva was prosecuted for corruption in the Operation Car Wash investigation, was found guilty, although that was later overturned, as one of the judges heading that up was found to have been not impartial. But of course, in 2018, the right-wing populist Jair Bolsonaro was elected. And again, he was very much in the mode of perhaps our former President Trump, or at least I think they were political allies. But after one term with Bolsonaro, then we see, as he ran for re-election in 2022, whether it be part of the pink wave or Lula's residual popularity. Again, in the first ballot, Lula was very close to the majority, which he would have needed to win outright on that first ballot, 48%, with Bolsonaro 43%. Bolsonaro closed the gap in the second round, and a very close but valid victory. And I think international witnesses and inspection agencies confirmed the accuracy of the count. Brazil has a very good system for counting ballots and validating results. So about a less than 2% margin for Lula da Silva, but he is elected for his third term, part of the current pink wave. Just a couple more here before we go to your comments and questions. Let's go to the next slide. Colombia. This is definitely a first. Largely ruled by conservative parties, for many years, occasional military interventions, a lot of problem with guerrilla movements, M19, FARC, ELN. But then in the 80s and 90s, these guerrilla movements, and finally in 2016, the last of them was brought into the political process. And now here we are in 2022, Gustavo Petro. He is an economist, but way back in the 70s and 80s, he was a member of the M19 guerrilla movement. Now, again, they were brought into the political process. They put down their weapons, said, we will run for office and accept the verdict of the voters. And so he was a member of the Colombian Congress for a number of years, but now running as for president last year. Again, 2 rounds required here, which is a better system, in my opinion. Petro did win 40%, 40.34% in the first round. Again, not a majority, therefore have to have the runoff. But here, and again, it was close, but he is able to defeat Rodolfo Hernandez, the independent candidate, 50.42 to 47.35%. So this is the first time Colombia has had a leftist president, at least certainly in recent memory. And finally, we'll move to, I think, our last example, Peru. Again, Peru has been through a lot of struggles. If you look at the left-hand side, Keiko Fujimori, the name may be familiar. Her father was president in the 1990s. He did help to wipe out or get rid of the Shining Path guerrillas that were terrorizing the entire country. But in the process of doing that, a lot of innocent people were killed and human rights violations were carried out. Also, he dismissed the Congress in 1992 and ruled by decree for the next 8 years. But in 2000, Fujimori was forced out, went into exile in Japan. He is of Japanese heritage, although born in Peru. In 2011, the first leftist president of Peru since 1968, Ollanta Humala was elected, but then he was relatively successful for 5 years, serve a 5-year term in Peru, but he could not succeed himself. So in 2016, Pedro Pablo Kuczynski was elected president. He was a conservative economist, but got implicated in the Obrecht bribery scandal and had to resign. His vice president then served very briefly and was in less than 2 years impeached and removed from office. Vizcarro's successor, Moreno, lasted 5 days as president, followed by a gentleman named Sagasti, so that they had 4 presidents in just 3 years. Now, as we see in 2021, an impoverished rural resident, Pedro Castillo, at least from an impoverished background, he did gain education, even though his parents were illiterate, peasants who had received land, though, from the land reform of the 1960s and 70s. But he became educated, became a school teacher, and you can see ran for president with a whole bunch of other candidates on that ballot, over a dozen. And he got only 18.92% in the first round of the voting. But then with a runoff with Keiko Fujimori, again, the daughter of the former president, who is in prison, by the way, he came back from Japan and was convicted and is serving a 20-plus year term for sedition, high treason, human rights violations, and other crimes. But very, very close. You talk about a close election. Castillo was elected with 50.13 to Fujimori with 49.87. less than 1% of the vote, even in the runoff. And of course, you know that things did not go well for President Castillo. He had a lot of trouble getting a cabinet established. He changed cabinet ministers, not just one or two, but 4 different cabinets in the first 6 months he was in office. There were 2 failed impeachment attempts. When they looked like the Congress was going to try to impeach him for a 3rd time, he then ordered the Congress dissolved, imposed a curfew, and pledged to draft a new constitution. But none of those were legal authority of the Peruvian president. So he was impeached and removed from office the same day, arrested also for high treason and sedition. He is in jail awaiting trial, as we speak. We also know the country exploded in protest over that, with many of the rural people and indigenous people, which are very numerous in Peru, feeling that Castillo was their representative and that he was unfairly removed. It's paralyzed the country. As you know, it's shut down many of their major tourist attractions. It's extremely costly. But I think looking overall at it, excuse me, he has been replaced by his first vice president, Dina Boluarte. But if you add them all up, that's the 6th president Peru has had since 2018. And that is the kind of instability that has plagued many of the Latin American countries in the past, and does not augur well for the future of Peru, which 10 years ago seemed to be on a much better path. But right now is not in a good place and not in a good situation, and grappling to try to find their way after this period of tremendous instability. So if we can move to the next one, looking at Argentina. And again, I'm not going to have time to go through this in detail, but their system is a little bit different. On the first round, you only have to win 45%, or if you win 40%, but are at least 10 percentage points ahead of the second place candidate, you can be elected on that first ballot. Otherwise, it will go to a runoff, as we've seen with several of the other countries. And right now, without going, that's public opinion polling, but the Peronist Party, which is the current administration of Alberto Fernandez and his vice president, Cristina Fernandez, not related, but Cristina was the wife and widow of Nestor Kirchner, who was a Peronist leader in the early 2000s. But as I said, the Argentine economy is really suffering right now. Sky high inflation, their currency devalued very seriously. So, excuse me, very little chance that their party will be reelected. The mayor of Buenos Aires is probably the leading candidate, represented in the yellow in the public opinion polls, but there's some tightening of that race, but that will be in October later this year. All right, if we could move to the next, and I think what my conclusion somehow got left off this slide. So we have the nice flags, but I also had typed in some conclusions, but I'll just quickly summarize those, and then we can go to your questions and comments. So certainly we have seen 2 pink waves in Latin America, and one was in the first decade of the 21st century, but we've certainly seen one now in more recent years as well, especially in some important countries like Colombia that have really never had leftist presidents before. We have a youth movement in Chile. So there are a lot of new things happening. Will this pink wave last? It may or may not, but as politics becomes more normalized and you have less of a threat of military intervention, and if the populace is allowed to make their own choice as to their leadership, which they certainly should be. That is the fundamental premise of a democratic system. You will see pendulum swings. And there is nothing wrong with that. As a given party is brought into power to correct some wrongdoing or shortcomings of the party previously in power, almost never can they fully accomplish all of their objectives. Things aren't even always under their own control, but politics is very messy and very complicated. Factors outside your country can play a big role in things like the COVID pandemic that certain countries handled better than others. And Bolsonaro's handling of it in Chile may have been the number one reason he wasn't able to be reelected. He had one of the highest death rates and highest infection rates of any country in the world. And he did not seem to be taking proper measures against it. So anything from the natural world to economic policy to global conditions of various types can play a role there. But for the most part, again, with some exceptions, such as Peru, and there are some troubling signs of erosion of some democratic norms and standards in some of the countries. We have 3 countries pursuing regimes, and I mean Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba, that I think history has shown cannot be successful, yet stubbornly adhering to some of those what I would consider outmoded principles. But on the whole, I think it's a very exciting region. I certainly enjoyed my visit there. Buenos Aires is a beautiful city, despite the economic problems. Again, if you bring American money, you really will probably not have any particular problem. So with that, as kind of an overall conclusion, I will end my remarks and be happy to open it up for questions or comments.
Thank you very much, Professor Farrell. I'm going to take the PowerPoint out and jump myself a little bit there. I had a question, and then we've had a couple questions come in so far, but in terms of Argentina, I have a friend who lives part of the year down there, and we don't talk all that often, but as you were saying, bring American currency and you'll do fine. Is there another currency at play in Argentina besides the official currency? Because he seems to hint at it, but never say anything explicitly. Is there another form of currency at work?
No, I don't believe so, but I believe what he is alluding to is, and this was brought up to us more than once, there is an official rate for the Argentine peso that you get at a bank, or if you use an ATM, and I, ask for $50 worth of money, I'll get X number of Argentine pesos. But if I have a $50 bill and I go to somebody else on the street, I will get 3 times as many Argentine pesos from that person on the street, because as weak as it is, the Argentine peso official rate is overvalued. And so the people will give you many more than the official rate. So I think that's what he's alluding to. And that's what happens whenever the currency is suspect and is artificially overvalued. It's the way it used to be in the Soviet Union with the ruble. It was even the way with the Russian ruble after the Soviet Union in the 1990s when I was there. So I think that's what they're alluding to. Some countries do have 2 separate currencies, but I don't think they do in Argentina. But I do believe what he's alluding to is the official versus the unofficial exchange rate.
Okay, so they're like human ATMs, essentially.
Yes, and I'm going to tell you, I did not do this. I think it's probably illegal, but other people that we had some association with did do this. And they said what the money changers really wanted were the nice, new, crisp American $100 bills with a blue line through it. And if you gave them that, you would get even a special premium right on top of that unofficial rate.
Wow. All right. Thank you. One question we have, and you sort of covered this in regards to Chile, but they were asking that they had just jumped in right before you got to there. But what are your thoughts on the recent win by the socialists in Chile? And in this person's opinion, this will be extremely interesting in the upcoming years. Would you agree, disagree?
Yes. And again, it's not unique because Michelle Bachelet, who served 2 4-year terms as president, starting in 2006, and then her second one in 2014. She was a socialist as well and did a lot to reform the educational system, try to democratize it, make higher education more readily available, public health. And I believe her position now or recently was with the World Health Organization. But in any event, she was then succeeded by the conservative Piñera. But people of Chile showed that they were really, many of them, it's hard to know if it's an absolute majority, but it looks like it, were tired of the pro-business, so-called neoliberal economic policies that Piñera was pursuing. And that's why you had this violent upsurge in 2019, where again, the country was shut down, not as extensive as in Peru at the present time, but still massive protests, the type Chile had not seen since the overthrow or the ending of the Pinochet dictatorship. And so with Piñera winning, again, he's only 35 years old. This is really wanting to turn a new page in Chilean politics. They don't want the conservative, pro-business, pro-banking policies of Piñera that they did have for 8 years. And I would also underline the vote for the vote to call the Constitutional Convention. And they went through the whole process and they selected delegates. The delegates met, they drafted the Constitution. Now, when they put the new Constitution up to the referendum vote, as was required, it was turned down pretty dramatically. Over 60% voted no. So, well, what that tells me is there's still a solid basis of moderation, but it's a left-leaning moderation. So they want to go left from where Piñera was, but they don't want to go as far as this incredibly ambitious and would have been easily the most progressive constitution in the world with 388 articles, 110 individual rights specifically enumerated. So I think that as far as Chile is concerned, the direction will be left of center, but be pulled back to the center by the vote on that referendum and the thought that they do not want to go extreme out on a limb, but maintain some ties to the more traditional society and ways, but a more progressive agenda overall.
Thank you. Keith, I believe you had a question, but it didn't come through completely. So if you could submit that again, that would be great. Anyone else have questions or comments, please just type them into the comments area and we will get to them now. I have a question that's sort of broad, just because and I'm not picking on mainstream media at all. I'm not politicizing it, but unless something really huge or revolutionary or literally revolutionary happens, you don't tend to hear too much or even read too much unless you're looking for it specifically about what's going on with the US's relationship to Latin America. Where is that? I know it's a very broad question, and that's perhaps another 3 lectures, but where are we headed?
No, I understand. I think what you're saying. In my opinion, the main attention Latin America gets from most Americans today focuses on the southern border and the fact that increasing numbers of asylum seekers, refugees, people seeking entry, and that is a concern for sure, and that's understandable. I did point out that poverty and violence, especially in the northern triangle of Central America, is probably the number one driver of that, although I know there's many from Venezuela now too. And because of deteriorating conditions there, although there may be some economic improvement recently in Venezuela. So that's the main reason. Otherwise, again, we have only one country in Latin America that we actually have a border with. That's Mexico. And, again, some people find even that problematic. I would go back to even the year 2001 when George W. Bush was elected president. He said at that time that he wanted to reorient American attention and interest to Latin America. He thought we had neglected them. And, as I pointed out, there's a lot of people there. And these are big countries with a lot of resources. We could benefit from closer ties with them. But what happened to that initiative by George W. Bush? 9/11. So all of a sudden, now we got to be focused on the Middle East again. And then we invade Iraq. We also send troops, of course, into Afghanistan. And we know those went on for years and years. And the Middle East is very hard. We wanted to then reorient more to East Asia because of rising China and the challenges that sets up in East Asia. And even that was hard for President Obama to redirect the pivot to Asia, which is what he said he wanted, but it was difficult because of, again, the Middle East. And now in the last year, Russia invades Ukraine. Mm-hmm. So there are just so many things that seem more urgent and are pulling our attention away from our neighbors, in our own hemisphere. And I agree with you. I think we could benefit by paying more attention. And quite honestly, just in going over the materials that I did for tonight's session with all of you folks, just having the opportunity over the last few weeks to go over all this material, I found it fascinating. It's really interesting. You can study the different electoral systems, and there's certainly plenty of excitement. It's not boring,
right?
Even without the military coups, which I'm glad we're not having, and the human rights abuses that went with that, the disappeared people. Again, not to ramble, but both in Chile and Argentina, those military regimes carried out what are called dirty wars. And there are still people whose parents or grandparents were disappeared and they never knew what ever happened to them. They're just thrown into the ocean, something like that. There are children who were kidnapped from the people that were executed and raised in families that were not their own, more or less by theft. This is another huge issue. So not discounting those horrible things that happened. They seem to have learned from that, and they have not gone back to any of that for the most part. Again, just quickly, in Honduras, that's part of the pink wave now too, because the new president there, the first woman, Xiomara Castro, she's actually the wife of a left-leaning president from 2005, Jose Manuel Zelaya, who was the last one thrown out by a military coup in Latin America. That was in 2009. And now here we are in the present day. His wife, the former first lady, is elected president of Honduras in her own right. And that's one of the most traditionally conservative countries. So there's a lot of reason for optimism. There's a lot of reason that to believe that progress can be made. A lot of the old economic mistakes are not going to be made again, like protectionism, trying to keep out foreign competition and imports and just subsidize inefficient industries. That's something that's held them back for decades. So I think there is a real learning curve in Latin America, and there's a lot of interesting things happening there. A lot of close elections, which political scientists enjoy. So those are all reasons that I agree with you. We should be paying more attention to Latin America.
We had another question come in that fortunately or unfortunately is another kind of sweeping, broad question. But Darlene Wellner, who I believe you're familiar with, she wanted you to please talk about what is happening environmentally in Central and South America. And, I would say in Mexico as well.
Yes. Okay. Well, that wasn't my main focus for tonight, but what I can tell you is, for example, Brazil. Bolsonaro, the more conservative president for the last 4 years, was not an environmentalist. I think he actually did support wind power and some solar installations. So to be honest, we have to include that. But as far as the Amazonian rainforest is concerned, he wanted nothing better than to chop down the trees, burn them up, and start cultivating that land and set up more cattle ranches and various agricultural and mining operations. Certainly gave a green light to all kinds of mining. But the Brazilian people, it was a close election, but it's hard to defeat an incumbent anyway. But the Brazilian people, did not approve of that, and they voted him out. And now Lula da Silva is back in office, and he is much more environmentally concerned and will do much more to protect the Amazon rainforest and the indigenous people that, still make their home within that. As far as all the others are concerned, it's kind of hard to generalize, but this is why it's important to have regional organizations such as the Organization of American States, because they have begun to set up guidelines to try to reduce carbon emissions. Because again, these are countries that are going to suffer from climate change as much or more than the more industrialized countries. They're still more dependent on agriculture, still more dependent on fishing, things that are very sensitive to climate change. But I did not prepare a report card as that would definitively answer how it's going. But to me, the vote in Brazil was the biggest referendum on the environment. Generally speaking, there are green parties in Latin America. Again, that is one of the things that, I mean green parties that actually hold office. So one thing that kind of hampers some of the presidents, and this was certainly the case in Peru with President Castillo. There are so many different parties represented. You saw the parties running candidates for president in Peru, 14 or 15. But there's also that many or even more represented in the legislature, in the Congress. And so it gets to be very difficult to get an agenda through. It's hard enough when you have only two major parties, to say nothing of building the coalitions that are required. But there is a strong environmental movement in Latin America, and it is mainly the left of center candidates who are in office more right now. It may not last, but they are more sensitive to it. So that's how I would at least try to address that.
Mark had a question. I think this is building a bit on the question that I asked about where to find out more about what's going on, since it's not as readily covered in the media. And Mark wanted to know, he admits it's a bit off topic, but what media sources do you read? Is it New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post? Where's the best place to find, what's a good source?
Those are all certainly very good, and I do either read them carefully or at least dip into. I don't read all of them. I was just reading the Wall Street Journal today. New York Times, I have a subscription. I like those. One of my favorites is The Economist. That's a British weekly news magazine. They would call it a newspaper, but it's a weekly. And I think they have more subscribers in the United States right now than they have in the United Kingdom, even though it is based out of the United Kingdom. They have excellent coverage of Latin America. I get something called Latin America Research Reports online. Every week they send me updates, so you can look into that. Latin America Research Report, and that's free, by the way. So they will definitely give you weekly updates, and I found it to be very accurate. So those are some that I use, and The Economist gives a very major section to Latin America every single week.
Great answer. We just had another question come in. I'm just going to throw it up right away because I saw who submitted it, and I trust that they'll ask something interesting. You mentioned some elections have international observers. I've always wondered, how is it decided which countries get observed and which don't? How is that possibly decided?
There's no single, authority that is, deciding that. But I think the way it generally works is that it's a non-governmental organization, NGO, that is allowed to operate within the country. And if they are allowed to operate within the country, then one thing they can do is request permission to monitor the elections. And this is, again, this is something that it's ultimately up to the country involved. There's no global thing, but there's no global authority on it. But if they want credibility for their elections, they will allow it. And again, Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela, they don't allow it. But the countries that want to be regarded as adhering to democratic norms, generally speaking, they will allow it, and the reports are made public. I didn't have time to go into detail, and I would want to do a little bit more research on it myself, but I was particularly impressed with this very close election, under 2 percentage points, in Brazil, and in a polarized society, and one where the Bolsonaro supporters, as you know, actually did carry out some rioting, allegedly on grounds that the election was not legitimate and was not fairly tallied. But the Brazilian institutions held strong, including their electoral commission and their courts, who said, no, this was very well run, legitimate, accurate count. And they have nationwide methods for ensuring the integrity of the vote, which frankly we don't have. And I'm not saying that the measures are deficient, but in the US, it is left up to each state. And even within the state, maybe the county. The different counties in Wisconsin may have different machinery for tallying the votes and casting and tallying the votes. But in Brazil, everything is uniform, and that makes it easier to validate, which they were able to do in just a few days. And there really hasn't been any serious questioning of that because of the effectiveness and the transparency of the system they have. So that's something I ran across here in this research that I'm going to delve into in more detail myself. But ultimately, these international observers are from the various non-governmental organizations that are operating in the country and do that specific function as long as they're allowed to do so.
We still have a little bit of time if anyone would like to get in another question or comment. While we have a pause in the action, I would like to remind people that should they want a copy of tonight's PowerPoint presentation, which was jam-packed with information, please just contact me. And here's my email address at work on the screen, tgodzinski@manitowoc.org. Get in touch with me, and I will email that out to you as quickly as you get it to me. So tgodzinski@manitowoc.org gets you tonight's fantastic PowerPoint presentation, 100% free of charge. There's not even postage involved. It's email, so it works out great. If anyone has any other questions or comments, now's the time to get them in. While we do have just a little time for people to think if they want to submit something. I wanted to thank Professor Farrell for being here tonight with this wonderful lecture. Thank you so much for this evening and being so flexible with the insanity of the weather and the conditions at the library and everything today. It all worked out, and I'm glad we have this in place so we didn't just have to cancel this evening. And thank you for being an anchor for 16 years, and I hope we certainly have more years to look forward to. And I certainly know that the committee, I don't even have to ask them. They'll just have you back again. So as long as the topics align, it's phenomenal. And another question did come in from Darlene. It was not a question at all, but it was thank you so much for coming again. So, you know what? I think we will just end on that unless somebody has a question. Oh, I think someone may have gotten. Everyone is just thanking you for a great presentation. So, and I'd like to throw my thanks in one more time.
One thing that I just thought of, the question of electoral observers, one of the most important groups is the Carter Center. And that is founded by Jimmy Carter, our former president who's now in hospice care. But that is one of the most important organizations that does monitor international elections. So you could look up their website and see what their activities are. But I should have mentioned them as one of the specific organizations carrying that out.
And what was that name again?
Carter Center, CARTER Center, the Carter Center.
Great. All right. Well, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Farrell, for being here. Thank you, everyone, for joining us online this evening. We will be back next week, weather permitting, to having the lecture in the Balkanski room at the library. But also, if you can't make it down to the library or should the weather turn south, we will be back here as well, presenting it in a hybrid format of in-person and online. And next week, our topic will be China and the U.S. So there may be a thing or two to talk about there as well. So for Manitowoc Public Library, for the League of Women Voters, for myself and for Professor Farrell, thank you so much for coming this evening. Have a great night, everyone.